Hi, in this talk we're going to talk about East Asia. These are a couple of satellite imageries from East Asia that I thought were interesting to give you an idea as to the part of the world that we're looking at. We're going to be talking about areas that are really highly populated and densely populated, and also sparsely populated. This is the Spratly Islands. You might hear about these in the news from time to time. This is the region of the world that we're looking at. So we have China. You can kind of see some overlap with Tibet, Western China, with Central Asia that we covered in previous chapter. But it includes China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, whatever Taiwan is. We might see a question about that on some of our short assignments. But by far, it's the most populous region in the world. It's got the most populous country, with India closely behind. It was economically advanced 1,000 years ago, and it's one of the core areas of the world economy and an emerging center of political power. These days, when we talk about resource management, there's going to be 1.3 billion Chinese people who are going to need resources. And as they kind of you move from a developing country to a highly developed country, these resources and these needs are going to increase exponentially. These are some of the environmental issues related to China. The Three Gorges controversy, that's about 15 years old now. But it was the flooding of one of the rivers in China. And it's caused some of the subsidiary issues with that. We have the Yangtze, soil erosion, forested areas, forest destroyed, and then desertification, as we see here in the Gobi Desert in northern and western China. Okay, and this is the area we're looking at here, the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River that goes out to the East China Sea. There's been little historical forest conservation in China. So some of the reforestation issues, programs have been largely unsuccessful. Japan has a relatively clean environment, and when we talk about population density, we'll look at that in a little bit. We'll see some of the reasons for that. In terms of Japan's physical environment, it's subtropical, but it's a volcanic island in essence, and it serves on a plate boundary. So it's very geologically active. So we can see right here the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Plate, and the Eurasian Plate where they meet. We've got a subduction zone right here. And we have Mount Fuji just outside of Tokyo that run up this core here. We also have a number of earthquakes that affect the Tibetan Plateau in southern and western China. Okay? But in 2011, there was a major tsunami that killed about 20,000 people north of Tokyo. So this is tectonically active, and also tsunamis are a big part of life here. You can see some of the prior earthquakes that we've had just in Japan alone, not including the 2011, where we had tsunami activity on the north coast here. This is Mount Fuji. Very picturesque. And then we can see the climate regimes in this region here. So we've got a couple of A's with our tropical down near Southeast Asia, but mainly we've got some C's in the highlands that we talked about before, and then some D's. This talks about some of the other environmental issues and physical geography issues. Southern China has rugged mountains interspersed with lowlands. Taiwan, very mild winter climate, and still some extensive forest. But when we look at the populations of those, it's going to be a challenge. Settlement patterns. Population of Japan is about 870 people per square mile. That's almost the most populous state in the United States. New Jersey is about 1,000 people per square mile. So there's very restricted living space in urban areas. And I've got a neat map here that shows some of these. Okay, so we look at Japan, and we can see what Japan looks like here on the whole, the islands here. It's located on 4 main islands. Okay, the extent of it is 4 main islands. It's about smaller than the state of California, about the size of Montana. And it's got about 3.5 times the population of California. And we zoom in, and you can see we zoom in enough, and we can see where this green gives way to this gray. Okay. Even around Mount Fuji, we can see it here. They're very picturesque, but we can see all of the urban areas around Mount Fuji here. And then we have these kind of large urban areas which run down the coast all the way down through Japan. Okay. So you can see the modification of the environment. So in places like Tokyo, just looking at the scale here, we're looking at 120 mile urban region right here. Extremely large. So we can look at the population densities here, and I showed this example here running from Tokyo through Kyoto, Hiroshima, and down to the south. We can see a dot density map that shows where population density is the highest in China. We have Beijing, Shanghai, and then running down to the south to Hong Kong and Macau. And we can see where it is for Taiwan. And then, like we said before, with Central Asia, sparsely populated in this part of the country here. So we have 1.3 billion people living in this country, but a lot of them are located in central and eastern China. These days, China is only about 30% urban. Rice is the dominant crop. We've got some wheat, other things too. Manchuria, which is the northern part of China here, is largely settled. The actual peninsula of Korea, peninsula is just a body of land surrounded on 3 sides by water, is made up of 2 countries. Until the 1950s, it just used to be Korea. Now we have a North Korea that we hear about in the news a lot, and a South Korea. So there's two geopolitical entities from the what used to be called the Kingdom of Korea. But it's still densely populated. So both North Korea and South Korea are about 77 million people, with a much higher population than that of Japan. And Taiwan is also densely populated with 23 million people, and a population density of 1,500 people per square mile. South Korea these days, when we talk about agriculture resource procurement, North Korea is trying to adopt a path of self-sufficiency. Hopefully in the 2015, 16, 17, 18, they've opened up a little bit more. But we'll see how this is in the future. Taiwan and South Korea are noted for their urban primacy, meaning that Taipei, Taiwan is by far the largest city in the country, and same with Seoul. Seoul has about 40% of the entire country's population, the actual urban area. And that might not even include the city. And so when we look at Seoul, it's a very large urban area. We can see why this is fairly important here. Okay, so we have this border here between North Korea and South Korea, but you can see how close Seoul is to North Korea. And we zoom out a little bit. So we've got North Korea, South Korea. We can see the isolation of South Korea, so you can understand how this is a proverbial powder keg in this particular region here. We can see that the population centers growth of Tokyo, cultural coherence and diversity. With Korea, it's adopted from the Chinese writing system, and then in the 1400s, Koreans created their own writing system. And the role of Confucian ideology. You can see some of the languages, like we said before, even culturally and religiously, how they're isolated in Western China. And this talks about, the evolution and the history of China throughout the years. Opium Wars and the different dynasties, the last of which, lasted through the early 20th century. This talks about the territories. You can see in green here, this was the Japanese Empire in the 40s, and now it's been reduced to this right here. Okay, how in 1910, Korea was actually run or, taken over by Japan for a period of time between 1910 and the end of World War II. And after World War II, there was the Korean War, where Soviet-backed North, U.S.-backed South, and which lead to that now the North Korea and South Korea division that we see today. And then we can just see the evolution of the different dynasties and the spatial extent of those. Rise of Japan, and Japan's revival after the devastation of World War II, and then the division of China between the communists and the nationalists, which now form Taiwan. Even though Taiwan is technically a part of China, how does the rest of the world view it? And you might see a short assignment on this. We've seen some of these. Okay. Current leader of North Korea. So how is that going to affect the region geopolitically? And some of the post-war geopolitics. The occupation of Tibet in the late 40s and early 50s. The Spratly Islands. You might hear about these on the news. We have the Spratly Islands. These islands located in the middle of the South China Sea. So these tiny little islands here, just situated between China, Vietnam, Philippines. This is Thailand. This is Malaysia over here, and Indonesia. And there's been large oil reserves found underneath these. So you can see, if you zoomed in enough, they're largely unpopulated, but who's going to fight for this oil here? The major player in this region here is China. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and how and if this oil can be exploited. Other issues that we see in China these days, China's human rights records, freedom of speech, freedom of internet, Tiananmen Square in 1989. To this day, we still don't know how many people were killed as a result of that. So, it's been, human rights have been a long-standing topic in the country of China, but there's been improved relations. And you can see some of the geopolitical issues here. We've got Hong Kong, used to be owned by Great Britain, and it was given back in 1997. And then we have this country here called Macau, which was given back from Portugal in 1999. This is the DMZ, demilitarized zone, which serves as the border, because they're technically still at war, between North Korea and South Korea. And then Japan has higher gross national income per capita than the U.S., low unemployment. So you can see where Japan has gone from the 40s to now, and maybe where North Korea hasn't with their isolationist policy. We can look at the exports and parts of China in this region which are doing well. Human development. So we can see some of these quality of life indicators that you might look at on the labs. And then the social development indicators here. And then some of the rising tensions, social conditions. China, has some regional contrast to social development. There's 1.3 billion people. There was the establishment of the one-child policy in some places, and a lot of places in China, for the most part, have eliminated that. But it's created a big gender imbalance, meaning now these days, people of childbearing age, there's regions where the division might be 60-40 or 70-30, male to female, and that's really having problems with rates of natural increase. So, how do we overcome that gender imbalance? Because only women can have children, no matter how many men there are. So how does that, get overcome? And that's about it for East Asia.